today's mindful moment. Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going to be tackling a pretty massive subject, going way back to explore what's known as the Axial Age.
Yeah, the Axial Age, spanning from roughly the 8th to the 3rd centuries BCE, a really unique period in history.
It's often described as this pivotal turning point for human thought and spirituality.
Mm.
When all these new ideas and belief systems started popping up all over the world.
And what's fascinating is that it wasn't just isolated to one particular region. We see these shifts happening simultaneously across different cultures.
Right. In Greece, you have the rise of philosophy and rationalism. In India, you have the development of Hinduism and Buddhism.
And in China, you have Confucianism and Taoism emerging. And in Israel, you have the prophets and the development of monotheism.
So many of the world's major religions and philosophies can trace their roots back to this era. It's like the whole world was going through this collective shift in consciousness.
Exactly, a sort of global awakening, if you will. And that's what we'll be diving into today. We'll be drawing primarily from Karen Armstrong's book, The Great Transformation, which offers a really fascinating perspective on this period.
Yeah, Armstrong does an amazing job of weaving together all these different threads, showing how these seemingly disparate movements were actually part of a larger global phenomenon.
Right, and she doesn't shy away from the complexities either. I mean, this wasn't some kind of peaceful, harmonious transition. There was a lot of upheaval, a lot of violence.
And that's something that really struck me as I was reading the book. We often think of the Axial Age as this time of great enlightenment, but it was also a time of tremendous turmoil and change.
Absolutely, and it's important to understand that context. Before we can really grasp the significance of the Axial Age, we need to understand the world that came before it.
A world that, by all accounts, was a pretty intense place to be.
Yeah, no kidding. Armstrong paints a vivid picture of societies grappling with unprecedented violence and uncertainty. From the expansion of the Aryans in India to the constant warfare in China, the old order was crumbling and people were searching for new ways to make sense of the world.
It seems like that kind of upheaval would really shake people's faith in the old ways of doing things.
Exactly. And that's where these new religious and philosophical ideas start to emerge. It's almost like a response to the chaos and uncertainty of the time, a search for meaning and stability in a world that suddenly felt very fragile.
So it wasn't just about new ideas popping up out of nowhere. It was more like a response to the very real challenges that people were facing.
Precisely. Take the example of Zoroaster, for instance. He was a priest in ancient Persia who was deeply disturbed by the violence and injustice he saw around him, particularly the cattle raids that were terrorizing his people.
So he was witnessing this firsthand, this brutality and chaos.
Yeah, and it led him to have a profound spiritual crisis. And from that crisis, he emerged with a new vision, a new understanding of the divine.
He challenged the traditional polytheistic beliefs of his time and introduced the concept of a single, all-powerful God, Ahura Mazda, who represented good and was locked in a cosmic battle with an evil force, Angramenu.
Right. It was a radical departure from the more passive, ritualistic practices of the past.
It's fascinating how this experience of intense, personal, and societal upheaval led to such a dramatic shift in his worldview.
And that's a theme we see recurring throughout the Axial Age, this idea that crisis and suffering can be catalysts for spiritual transformation.
It makes me think about the role of ritual in those early societies.
Yeah, rituals were a big part of life back then, weren't they?
In many cultures, they were a way to connect with the divine, to appease the gods, to ensure a good harvest, or to ward off evil.
Exactly, and those rituals often involved sacrifice, offering something precious to the gods in hopes of gaining their favor or protection.
Right, and it wasn't always like a symbolic sacrifice. In some cases, it involved actual animal or even human sacrifice.
Yeah, which to us today sounds pretty horrific, right?
It definitely challenges our modern sensibilities.
But if you think about it from the perspective of those early societies where life was often precarious and unpredictable,
where people were constantly facing famine, disease, and war, it makes sense that they would seek ways to appease these powerful forces that seem to control their fate.
yeah, I mean, ritual sacrifice was a way to try to make sense of the chaos, to find some semblance of order in a world that often felt completely out of control.
And it wasn't just about fear and appeasement either. Some rituals were also about celebration, about expressing gratitude for the good things in life.
Right, celebrating the harvest, the changing seasons, the birth of a child.
It seems like ritual played a really complex and multifaceted role in those early societies.
Absolutely. It was a way to connect with the sacred, to confront the mysteries of life and death, and to find meaning and purpose in a world that could often feel overwhelming.
But then something started to shift. As we enter the Axial Age, we see a move away from this externally focused, ritual-based approach to a more internal, introspective one.
Yeah, it's almost like people were starting to look inward, to question the old ways of doing things, and to search for a deeper, more personal connection with the divine.
And this shift is reflected in the emergence of new ideas and concepts, like kenosis, or self-emptying.
Ah, yes, kenosis. That's a key theme that runs through many of the Axial Age traditions.
But what does that actually mean to empty oneself? It sounds kind of abstract and maybe even a little bit scary.
Well, it's not about literally emptying yourself of everything. It's more about letting go of the ego, of surrendering to something larger than oneself.
So it's about transcending the limitations of the individual self and connecting with something more universal.
Exactly. And it's not about passivity either. It's about actively engaging with the world, but from a place of humility and compassion.
I see. So it's like stepping outside of our own narrow perspectives and opening ourselves up to a wider reality.
Precisely. And this idea of kenosis manifests in different ways across the various Axial Age traditions. But the underlying principle is the same: a shift from an egocentric to a more other-centered way of being.
And a recognition that true fulfillment comes not from pursuing our own selfish desires, but from connecting with something larger than ourselves.
Right. It's a profound shift in consciousness, and it has implications not only for our personal lives, but for how we organize our societies and interact with the world around us.
Well, this is fascinating. We've only just scratched the surface, but I'm already sensing how this period really was a turning point in human history. I'm eager to delve deeper and see how these ideas play out in the specific cultures and movements that emerged during the Axial Age.
Me too. And that's exactly what we'll be doing in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned, folks. We've talked a lot about the shift toward internal reflection and self-cultivation during the Axial Age, but it's important to remember that this didn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Of course not. It was happening against a backdrop of some pretty intense social and political upheavals.
Exactly, and different cultures responded to these challenges in very different ways.
Which is what makes this whole period so fascinating. You have these parallel movements happening all over the world, each grappling with these universal questions, but coming up with unique solutions.
Right, and those solutions often reflected the specific circumstances and challenges that each culture was facing.
So it's not like there's a one-size-fits-all approach to the big questions of life.
Not at all, and that's what's so refreshing about studying the Axial Age.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think outside of our own limited perspectives and to appreciate the diversity of human thought and experience.
So let's dive into some of those specific examples. We left off talking about China, where Confucianism was emerging as a major force.
Yeah.
But there was another, perhaps less well-known, philosophy brewing there as well, legalism.
Ah, yes, legalism. A fascinating and often controversial school of thought.
Controversial, huh? Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. What made the legalists so different from the Confucians?
Well, if Confucianism was all about cultivating virtue and moral harmony, legalism was about establishing order through strict laws and punishments.
So more of a tough love approach to social engineering.
You could say that. They believed that human nature was inherently selfish, and that the only way to create a stable and prosperous society was to impose a clear set of rules and enforce them rigorously.
Okay, that definitely sounds a bit more authoritarian than the Confucian emphasis on education and self-cultivation.
It was, and it makes sense when you consider the context, China at that time was in a state of almost constant warfare, the Warring States period, as it's known.
Right. It was a chaotic and brutal time. And in that kind of environment, I can see how a philosophy that prioritized order and stability might have appealed to some people.
Exactly. The legalists believed that strength and efficiency were the keys to survival, and that a strong ruler with absolute authority was needed to maintain order and protect the state from its enemies.
So they were less concerned with moral persuasion and more focused on practical results.
Precisely. They believed that the ends justified the means, even if those means were harsh or seemingly unjust.
It's interesting how their philosophy seems to reflect the very conditions they were living in, this kind of like survival of the fittest mentality.
Exactly. And their influence on Chinese history was significant. The Qin dynasty, who ultimately unified China for the first time, adopted legalist principles as their guiding philosophy.
So they put those ideas into practice on a grand scale.
They did. And while the Qin dynasty was short-lived, their legacy was lasting. They laid the foundations for a centralized bureaucratic system that would shape Chinese governance for centuries to come.
Wow. So even though legalism might not be the most heartwarming philosophy, it clearly had a real impact on the course of history.
It did. And it raises some important questions about the balance between order and freedom, between individual rights and the needs of the state.
Questions that are still relevant today, I'd say.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to see how these different philosophies emerge in response to the same set of challenges. It highlights the complexity of human thought and the diversity of approaches to the big questions of life.
So we have Confucianism focused on moral cultivation, legalism focused on order and control. But China, during the Axial Age, wasn't just about strict rules and social engineering, right? There's also Taoism.
Ah, yes, Taoism. A breath of fresh air, some might say.
Yeah, from what I know of Taoism, it seems to take a very different approach. Less about imposing order from the outside and more about aligning oneself with the natural flow of the universe.
Exactly. If Confucianism was about refining human behavior and legalism was about controlling it, Taoism was about embracing the way things are, the Tao.
The Tao. Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Yeah.
What exactly is the Tao?
It's a tricky concept to pin down. It's often translated as the way, but it's more than just a path or a set of rules.
So it's not like a recipe for living a good life.
Not exactly. It's more like a fundamental principle that underlies all of reality, the force that flows through everything, connecting all things.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. It's like the underlying energy or essence of the universe.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And the key to living a good life, according to Taoism, is to align yourself with this Tao.
So to act in harmony with the natural order of things, to go with the flow, as they say.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the central concepts in Taoism, Wu Wei.
Wu Wei. Okay, I've heard that term too, but again, not sure I totally grasp it.
It's often translated as non-action or effortless action, but it's not about passivity or laziness.
So I shouldn't just quit my job and sit around meditating all day.
Well, meditation is certainly a part of Taoist practice, but Wu Wei is more about acting in accordance with the Tao. It's about letting go of our need to control and manipulate things and instead trusting in the wisdom of nature, allowing things to unfold naturally.
So it's like a kind of surrender, letting go of the ego's need to be in charge.
Exactly. And it's not always easy. We humans tend to want to impose our will on the world, to make things happen according to our own plans.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that.
But the Taoists believe that this kind of striving often leads to more suffering. When we resist the natural flow of things, we create friction and disharmony.
So Wu Wei is about finding that sweet spot where effort meets ease, where we're working with rather than against the forces of the universe.
Precisely. And this principle applies not only to our personal lives, but also to leadership and governance.
Oh, interesting. So how would a Taoist approach to leadership differ from, say, the Confucian model of the virtuous ruler?
Well, for the Confucians, the ideal ruler was a wise and benevolent figure who guided the people through moral example and instruction. But the Taoists were skeptical of this kind of top-down approach.
So they were more in favor of a hands-off approach to governance, letting people figure things out for themselves.
Yeah, more or less. Laozi, the legendary sage who's credited with writing the Tao Te Ching.
Oh yeah, the classic text of Taoism.
He believed that the best ruler was one who governed least, who created the conditions for people to flourish without unnecessary interference or control.
So kind of like a gardener who tends the soil and provides the right conditions for growth, but doesn't try to force the plants to grow in a particular way.
That's a beautiful analogy, and it's a radical departure from the Confucian model of the active and engaged ruler.
It's almost like Taoism is a philosophy of trust, a belief that the universe has its own wisdom, and that if we just get out of the way, things will work out as they should.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that. And it's a perspective that I think can be really valuable, especially in our modern world where we're so used to trying to control and manipulate everything.
It's a good reminder to let go sometimes, to surrender to the flow of life, and to trust in the wisdom of something larger than ourselves. But I'm curious, we've talked about these three distinct philosophies, Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism. Did they coexist peacefully in ancient China, or were they seen as competing ideologies?
That's a great question. And what's so remarkable about Chinese thought is that these philosophies weren't seen as mutually exclusive. They could coexist, even complement each other, offering a more holistic approach to understanding the human condition.
So it's not like you had to pick one and stick with it.
Not at all. In fact, many Chinese thinkers drew inspiration from multiple traditions, weaving together different ideas and practices to create their own unique worldview.
It's like a philosophical buffet. You can take what you like and leave the rest.
Exactly. And that's something I think we can learn from, this ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to appreciate the nuances and complexities of life.
Especially in our own time, where everything seems so polarized and we're constantly bombarded with these simplistic either arguments.
Right. The Axial Age reminds us of the importance of nuance, of recognizing that truth is often multifaceted and that different perspectives can offer valuable insights. But speaking of different perspectives, let's shift our focus now from the East to the West and explore what was happening in ancient Greece during this pivotal era.
Greece, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and those epic myths and tragedies that have captured imaginations for centuries. I'm ready to dive in. What were the Greek thinkers up to during this period of global transformation?
We've journeyed from the bustling cities of ancient China to the sun-drenched shores of ancient Greece, witnessing how different cultures grapple with the profound shifts of the Axial Age.
Yeah, and it's amazing to see how these universal questions about the meaning of life suffering and the pursuit of truth resonated across such diverse cultures.
Absolutely. And as we move into the later stages of the Axial Age, we see a new generation of thinkers emerging, building on the foundations laid by their predecessors.
Right, like refining those radical ideas, shaping them into like more complex and nuanced systems of thought.
Exactly. And in ancient Greece, no figure embodies this more than Plato.
Plato, the student of Socrates and one of the most influential philosophers of all time. His ideas really did shape the course of Western thought, didn't they?
They did. And, it's interesting to think about how Plato's philosophy was deeply influenced by the dramatic events of his own life.
Oh, yeah? Like what specifically?
Well, the execution of his teacher, Socrates, had a profound impact on him. It made him question the very nature of justice and truth and the fragility of human society.
It's like he saw firsthand how easily a society could turn against even its wisest members.
Exactly. And it led him to search for a more stable foundation for knowledge and morality, something that transcended the whims of popular opinion or the dictates of political power.
So instead of just accepting the values of his society, he started to look deeper, searching for something more universal and enduring.
Right. And this search led him to develop his famous theory of forms.
Okay, the theory of forms. Now that's one of those philosophical concepts that I've always found a bit tricky to wrap my head around. Can you break it down for us?
Sure. It's the idea that there exists a realm of perfect and eternal concepts, things like justice, beauty, goodness, that exist beyond the constantly changing world we experience through our senses.
So it's like there's this higher reality, a blueprint for the world, filled with perfect archetypes. And true knowledge comes from understanding these forms rather than just relying on our limited, often deceptive senses.
That's a great way to put it. Imagine a perfect circle, You'll never encounter one in the physical world, right? Every circle we draw or see is just an imperfect approximation. But the idea of a perfect circle, that's a form. It exists in this higher realm of pure concepts.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So for Plato, the physical world is like a shadow or a reflection of this higher realm of forms. And true knowledge comes from grasping these eternal truths that lie beyond the realm of appearances.
Exactly. It's about using our reason and logic to transcend the limitations of our senses and access this higher reality.
It's a pretty mind-bending idea, but I can see how it would appeal to someone like Plato, who was searching for something solid and unchanging in a world that felt increasingly unstable.
Absolutely. And while the theory of forms might seem abstract, for Plato, it had very real implications for how we live our lives and how we organize our societies.
So it wasn't just about philosophical speculation. It was about finding a path to a good and just life.
Exactly. For Plato, understanding the forms was essential for both individual and societal flourishing. But while Plato was exploring the realm of forms in Greece over in China, Mencius, a follower of Confucius, was developing his own ideas about human nature and the good life.
Right. Mencius, he had a much more optimistic view of human nature than, say, the legalists, didn't he?
He did. While the legalists believed that human beings were inherently selfish and needed to be controlled through strict laws and punishments, Mencius argued that humans were innately good.
Inherently good. That's a pretty bold claim, especially considering the violence and turmoil that was happening all around him.
It was. But for Mencius, this goodness wasn't some naive or idealistic notion. He believed that we are all born with a natural inclination towards compassion, righteousness, and wisdom. These qualities, he argued, are like seeds within us, waiting to be nurtured and cultivated.
So it's not like we're automatically good, but we have the potential for goodness within us.
Exactly. And for Mencius, the key to unlocking that potential lay in education, self-cultivation, and right action.
So it's about creating the conditions for our innate goodness to flourish, rather than trying to impose it from the outside.
Precisely. And this has implications not only for our personal lives, but also for how we govern our societies.
Right. So for Mencius, the role of a leader isn't to control or coerce people, but to inspire and guide them towards virtue.
Exactly. He believed that a true leader leads by example through their own compassion, wisdom, and integrity.
It's a powerful idea. It suggests that true power lies not in force, but in the ability to inspire and uplift others.
Absolutely. And while Mencius and Plato might have had different ideas about the nature of reality and the path to the good life, they both shared a deep commitment to ethical living and a belief in the transformative power of wisdom. But, amidst all this talk of virtue, self-cultivation, and the pursuit of knowledge, we can't forget about the problem of suffering.
Yeah, suffering is kind of a universal human experience, isn't it? And it seems like the Axial Age thinkers were keenly aware of that.
They were, and one of the most powerful and enduring explorations of human suffering comes from the Hebrew tradition, the Book of Job.
Job, okay, I vaguely remember this story. Isn't he like a righteous man who gets struck by all these terrible misfortunes?
That's right. Job is a man who seems to have it all: wealth, family, good health, but then suddenly he loses everything. His livestock is stolen, his children are killed, and he's stricken with a painful and debilitating disease.
It's like the ultimate test of faith.
It is. And throughout his ordeal, Job struggles to understand why this is happening to him. Why would a just and loving God allow such suffering to befall a righteous man?
It's a question that has haunted humanity for millennia, hasn't it? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is there so much pain and injustice in the world?
Exactly. And what makes the Book of Job so compelling is that it doesn't offer any easy answers. It doesn't try to explain away suffering or to provide a simple theological justification for it.
So it's not like those stories where the moral is always everything happens for a reason.
Not at all. The Book of Job confronts us with the raw reality of suffering, the mystery of divine justice, and the limits of human understanding.
It's almost like an invitation to embrace the questions rather than clinging to simplistic answers.
Exactly. And while Job's story is rooted in the Hebrew tradition, this theme of grappling with suffering resonates across cultures and throughout history. It's a universal human experience.
And it seems like the Axial Age marked a turning point in how humans confronted that experience. It's like they were collectively awakening to the reality of suffering, the fragility of life, and the need to find a way to make peace with it all, even when it didn't make sense.
You've hit the nail on the head. And this recognition of the pervasiveness of suffering led to the development of new spiritual practices and paths to liberation. In India, for instance, we see the rise of bhakti traditions.
Bhakti, I've heard that term before. It's about devotion to a particular god or goddess, right?
That's right. Bhakti is about cultivating love and devotion for a deity like Shiva, Vishnu, or Krishna. And through that devotion, through that surrender to a higher power, practitioners seek to find solace, strength, and ultimately liberation from the cycle of suffering.
So it's a more personal and emotional approach to spirituality, as opposed to the more intellectual and philosophical paths we've been discussing.
You could say that. Bhakti is about opening the heart, connecting with the divine through love and surrender, and finding meaning and purpose even in the face of pain and impermanence.
It's fascinating to see all these different threads. The philosophical inquiries of Plato and Mencius, the existential wrestling of Job, the emergence of devotional practices like Bhakti all weave together to form this rich tapestry of the Axial Age.
It's a tapestry that continues to inspire and challenge us today. And as we wrap up our deep dive into this remarkable period, I hope you'll continue to explore these ideas and to see how they might inform your own life and your own search for meaning and purpose.
What an incredible journey this has been. From the birth of monotheism to the rise of philosophical rationalism, the Axial Age really did lay the groundwork for so much of what we value and believe in today.
It did. And for those of you who want to dive even deeper into this fascinating period, we highly recommend Karen Armstrong's book, The Great Transformation. We've included a link in the show notes where you can purchase a copy.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to our show and share it with your fellow knowledge seekers. We're always exploring new and fascinating topics, uncovering hidden truths, and challenging conventional wisdom.
So until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and keep seeking.